Very much. I am thrilled to be here and thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining this event from within the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I would also like to acknowledge that others are joining us from other traditional and unceded Indigenous territories across this beautiful province and country. Welcome to Canada and the UK Foundations for Innovation webinar. Thank you all for joining us. We're very excited to be here, so to speak, and to host this event virtually. Over the past year, Life Sciences BC and our community have fortunately embraced virtual events. We're grateful that we've been able to host webinars and events and bring our ecosystem together. Today, most of our speakers are actually joining us from outside of BC, so welcome, a special welcome to all of you. We will start this event by reviewing the regulatory process of how innovative medicines are launched in Canada. Next, we'll have a panel discussion with experts who will explore some of the national pharmaceutical policies that are currently under review and how this may impact the life sciences innovation sector. Finally, we will virtually jump across the pond, so to speak, and go to the UK, where Sir John Bell will join us to provide us with an overview of the UK life sciences strategy, followed by a discussion of best practices that are potentially applicable to Canada. For those of you that do not know, Life Sciences BC is a not-for-profit organization. Our members consist of academia, research institutions, centers of excellence and funding agencies, emerging small and medium-sized and growing companies in the areas of digital health, medtech, therapeutics, increasingly bioinformatics and AI, and those companies that support the life sciences ecosystem broadly. We're funded through membership and the generous contributions of our sponsors and partners. So today I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event, our conference partner, Pfizer Canada, our event sponsors, AbbVie and Innovative Medicines Canada, and our event supporter, Digby Global. Thank you for your investment in Life Sciences BC and the ecosystem. We're very grateful for your support. At each event, we like to introduce our latest new members. And so these are today, we'd like to welcome Alliance Scientific, Horizon Therapeutics, and Willow Biosciences. Welcome to the LSBC family. We're always welcoming new members, so please reach out to any of us at Life Sciences BC or go to our website, lifesciencesbc.ca for information. So now on to our first session. Without further delay, I would like to introduce Bob Dawson, who's going to introduce the session and the speaker.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you to Life Sciences BC for organizing this event. Pfizer is very proud to be part of it. And good morning and good afternoon to all of you who have joined today. As Wendy mentioned, the first session is about how pharmaceutical therapeutics get approved in Canada. This is not a particularly easy topic to present. In fact, when I asked Mark if he would consider doing this presentation, I was reminded of the story of Zsa Zsa Gabor's 8th husband when he's asked about marriage, and he said, "I know what's expected of me, but the challenge I have is making it interesting." Well, if anyone can make this session interesting, it's Mark Legault. I've had the pleasure of working with Mark for over a decade at Pfizer. He's our subject matter expert in PMPRB, and he leads our strategic pricing and access division. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. It's a great pleasure to be with everybody this morning. I will share my slides and get going with the presentation. Just bear with me. So good morning. Yes, it is truly a challenging conversation to have, avoiding the jargon, avoiding the acronyms, avoiding the complexity that is inherent in the regulation of prices in Canada. But I'll do my best to bring you through a story which I think at the very least should engage you in terms of a dialogue and a conversation for the rest of the presentation. To do that, I wanted to set it up with a brief description of the pathways that patients undertake in terms of getting reimbursement in this country, in terms of the roles of various institutions and actors that are there to hopefully facilitate a quick decision in terms of access, which unfortunately is increasingly leading to more and more delays in terms of that pathway. So I'll speak to this a little bit. I will speak in depth to PMPRB and where we are in terms of the journey with the transformation that PMPRB is bringing to Canadians over the last 5 years. I'll talk a little bit in terms of where PMPRB sees itself today as published in the most recent annual report. I'll talk very briefly about the regulatory tools and the implications this will have at a very high level without engaging in too much jargon. I'll talk about the unintended consequences and the opportunities I think that are ahead of us, and then signal to everyone the important yet ongoing evaluation of the guidelines from a monitoring perspective as to what's going to happen in the future, and point to a consultation that's currently underway, which is closing on June 21st, where I hope many of you will once again put pen to paper and engage in the conversation. So for Canadians, the journey to reimbursement involves many actors, starting with Health Canada, who looks at a submission from a manufacturer from a point of view of the safety and efficacy of the medicine or the health intervention or the technology. That process involves a regulatory approval, which is led by regulatory professionals whose job it is to file information in a manner which makes the job as easy as possible for Health Canada officials to make a recommendation in terms of the notice of compliance. In Canada, that notice of compliance comes with a patent status or a patent conferring that initially sets a framework for PMPRB jurisdiction, which is the key theme of this conversation. PMPRB as an agency of Health Canada enforces regulations that are linked to the Patent Act in terms of the requirements of a patentee, which is what the term is from a lingo perspective with these new innovations. A patentee's responsibility is to adhere to both the regulations and the guidelines in terms of compliance with prices. This has been true for the better part of 30 years. I've had the privilege in my professional career at Pfizer for more than the last decade to be leading the function within Pfizer, whose role it is to contextualize to Pfizer globally and locally the requirements that the PMPRB has and has had on patented medicines in this country, setting the non-excessive price that the PMPRB confirms to patentees and to indeed to Canadians through the annual report. For the better part of that 30 years, we've been operating with a regime that has been complex, but certainly has been predictable, certainly has been characterized as having a bright line in terms of where the challenges, where the risks were from both sides of the table, meaning from the regulator's point of view as well as the patentee's point of view. 5 years ago, a conversation that occurred that set into motion a number of key considerations that adds complexity to this conversation. This complexity will then bring us into a number of challenges that's going to impact not only how we look at the next gate in terms of patient access, but also in terms of the challenges to patients themselves in terms of timely access to medicines. PMPRB, once they set the ceiling price, or once they had set the ceiling price, then allows the manufacturer to proceed with certainty through a various technical assessments referred to here as HTA or Health Technology Assessment from a Quebec INES point of view or a CADITH or a P-Quarter point of view in oncology, to look at, actually to round this out as well as NACI from a vaccines point of view, to look at the pharmacoeconomic value dossiers in terms of guidance and a recommendation for public payers in terms of funding. That then results in a framework for which negotiations undergo on the public side, which results in public listings at the formulary level or other programs and mechanisms where Canadians would then benefit from reimbursement in this space. The private markets over the last 10 years, certainly over the last 5 years, are continually competing with themselves, completely looking for a niche in the market space to grow as businesses and increasingly engage with the pharmaceutical manufacturers and therapeutics that are coming to Canada in terms of navigating what value best meets their employers and employees in terms of value in order for reimbursement to occur. And as a result of that, the majority of Canadians benefit from some form, public or private, or a combination of both, in terms of making drugs affordable from a reimbursement point of view. For the past 5 years or so, we have been on a journey with PMPRB in terms of initially a self-reflection around the modernization of the guidelines, which questioned the approach being used by PMPRB over the last 10 to 15 years since the last major revamp of the guidelines, which has put us on a journey of quite honestly, rather technical and rather complex conversations that I won't get into today. The illustrations here point to public documents over the past 5 years that PMPRB has produced in terms of their reflection, their approach, their unique direction in terms of what they believe to be the new path forward in terms of what the PMPRB should be doing with respect to new regulations and new guidelines, which are coming into force July 1st, 2021. Canadians have been actively engaged in providing feedback throughout this journey. And I must say from a personal point of view, the growing concerns and the growing engagement across the stakeholders is an important signal that perhaps our journey is evolving in a manner which is inconsistent with both life science, innovation, patient access, increasingly over time, and I'll speak to more of this in a second. It's important also to reflect on where the PMPRB sees itself today. This is an example of materials that I sourced from the annual report, which describes to you where PMPRB sees themselves as an actor within the ecosystem, which results in reimbursement at the provincial level, which is where the majority of Canadians benefit from drug insurance on the public side. As a result of that, you can see that there's quite a significant overlap in terms of the PMPRB's exercise price monitoring investigations that overlaps a number of other actors in this space, which I think is an important comment in terms of how increasingly pervasive the PMPRB's approach is into multiple actors, other obligations, either constitutional, either administrative, either drug insurance, which questions really the value add that PMPRB is bringing in terms of the clarity of their role versus the clarity of others, which I think needs to be further refined. In terms of what's waiting for us in July, I'll summarize two big key themes for the group. Theme number one is the introduction within the regulations and now, of course, within the guidelines of economic-based price regulation concepts and factors in the form of pharmacoeconomic evaluations, which is seen and characterized as being a high risk to the Canadian system, where tools are being proposed which are at the very least challenging methods, poorly adapted, I would argue, for the purposes of price regulation, provide guidance from an HTA or health technology point of view, but do not serve well on the price regulation side, with challenges I won't get into, but the complexity, even to professionals who have been in this space for more than a decade, find challenging to describe, challenging to administer, and indeed the board staff themselves are continually being challenged to provide clarity as to the intent, the purpose, and how the rules will be applied. The second key point here is that on July 1st, 2021, Canada will begin referencing new countries We will drop referencing to the US market and the Swiss market, and we will add Australia, Belgium, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, and Spain to our international reference pricing basket, which will forward a significant change to the marketplace in terms of the quote-unquote PMPRB 11, which is the new basket of countries, which will introduce an important new concept which has not been seen before, which is a regulated reduction based on international price trends of markets that were purposely chosen because they do experience price erosion in those markets, so that list prices over time will fall as other markets adjust price, and Canada will be reimporting price concession mechanisms from other countries into our market over time. Quickly, unintended consequences in the form of guidelines that are counterproductive, an operating environment which is increasingly affording unpredictability in terms of how and when a price would be seen to be compliant, when investigations would be open and closed, and indeed offer a challenge in terms of, again, even for those of us who've been around in this space for many, many years, an operating environment that is not recognizable and offers challenge. The last comment is, of course, is the focus that the current approach has on breakthrough therapeutics, therapeutics that materially impact in a positive way the lives of Canadians, which are characterized as high risk from PMPRB's point of view, will be impacted sooner as opposed to later, given the challenges that are being proposed. Unfortunately, over the past 5 years, instead of talking about the opportunities to advance Canada, to advance our life science sector, to advance innovation and market access for patients to benefit from these breakthrough therapies, we've not been talking about the value that collaboration can bring in this space in terms of everyone working together to advance science and the benefits that can bring. We have not been working in the space of real-world evidence generation for purposes of advancing market access. We've not advanced there. And finally, we have not, unfortunately, advanced further in looking at outcomes-based agreements as a mechanism to address the challenges of breakthrough therapies in the Canadian market space. I'll point to the current consultation process, which is underway, which is going to close on June 21st. This is an important document because for the first time it highlights how PMPRB will evaluate the guidelines through an evaluation plan that will assess what are the intended and unintended consequences. For 5 years, we've been asking a pretty straightforward question. What is the goal? What is the purpose of these reforms? And how do we know that these reforms have not gone too far? Hopefully, this will address, in part, the challenges we face moving forward, and the policy framework that's being proposed here highlights to the audience what PMPRB wants to consider. And I would hope your active involvement, and I encourage all of you to, if you can, comment to PMPRB as to what you think an appropriate evaluation framework should and could look like to advance innovation in science in this country. So thank you for your time, and I'll now open it up to Wendy for questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was very, very informative, and you did a good job in trying to simplify an extremely complex topic. So Bob was right. You were more than up to the task. So for everybody attending, please submit questions to the Q&A. In the meantime, I have some that I'm going to ask, but please, we want to make this as interactive as possible that you can. So, Mark, one of the things that I think is really interesting in this, and I really liked your slide where you had the lines going across about where each of these various bodies are playing. And a theme with PMPRB is that they've sort of promoted their status to have broader reach than what they were originally set up to do. And as you commented, many people have written letters and commented on that. Why do you think it hasn't been necessarily effective to stop that to date?
Listen, that's a great question. The challenge is that we're not really having a dialogue and a conversation that gets to the core and heart of the problem we're trying to solve together. Mm-hmm. We are really dealing with an agenda that is experimental in approach and purposely designed to regulate a market in a way that's uncharacteristic so far in the kind of the evolution of the Canadian pharmaceutical space, and really tries to intervene in a number of different areas where the perception of value is a big challenge for payers, with tools that regulate or ratchet down prices without necessarily talking about how to contextualize the full value, which is why I was bringing up the lost opportunity around real-world evidence and outcomes-based agreements as an alternative approach. But we've just simply not been able to have a dialogue beyond a response to a very narrow technical questions that has been characterizing the consultation process for more than 5 years.
And given that a big part of this process is the basket of countries, which you commented on, is we're losing a few, we're picking up a few. Does that inherently mean that Canada will never be a first market of choice for a new therapeutic if it isn't if it already isn't launched somewhere else?
It's going to be a challenge to comply with regulations and guidelines when you have so much missing information when you come to market. If we are invented in Canada. In my hypothetical, let's say we invented a new therapeutic in Canada and came to market in Canada as the first market. There's that absence of information that is the minimum requirement for PMPRB to confirm whether or not you are compliant or not, which is why the uncertainty is such a key theme. We need a mechanism to deal with evidence generation or absence of information, but still be compliant with these rules, and that pathway has yet to be articulated by PMPRB.
And given where the life sciences sector is right now, with obviously organizations like Pfizer and others have lots of a big, rich pipeline of products that they're looking to bring forward. We also have a very strong, we're at a place that we have a very strong Canadian-based biotech sector. And we're increasingly seeing those Canadian biotechs looking to other markets first. And I think that's part of this complexity that you're talking about. We do have a couple of questions. One person is asking you to dive a little bit deeper into the role of CADETH. And maybe you could also just say what that acronym means as you explain CADETH's role, because everybody may not be aware of it.
The Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health is a body that's been around, it's been in Canada for more than 35 years, looking at value from a pharmacoeconomic and a broad health systems perspective to assess value thresholds in this country for the purposes of adopting new therapeutics for the purposes of reimbursement in this country. I hope that answers the question.
Right. There is a comment which I think is a great comment that I want to share. So this is obviously very complex, and I think it's fair to say it can become quite emotional because this topic has become so polarizing, depending on where you sit in the broader ecosystem and what stakeholder you represent. And there has been times before the pandemic that global pharma was probably accused of not worrying about price and how it impacts patients as much as having sat within them. I know we have always cared, but it just sometimes doesn't translate very well. So the real question that's being asked is, what is the right price for patented medicines? And is Canada above or below this price? And often, as we already know, the current arguments don't really convince the politicians that the path they're going is the wrong path. I think partly due to the complexity, of course. And the unintended consequences are very difficult to measure. So you're being asked to comment on how do you, there has been a long history of if something happens, something horrible is going to follow. And the market has adapted. So how do you bring meat to the unintended consequences and get the two, this polarized topic to come together a little bit better?
Look, that's a fantastically broad comment, but let me break it down to you this way. Affordability in my household is a function of the insurance that I have, and I live in the province of Quebec, where I benefit from a regime in this province that makes a public drug insurance that, be it public or private insurance, my out-of-pocket expenses and that of my families is capped. So the provinces make drugs affordable through insurance and programs to the best of their ability, matching their budgets and the provincial priorities. That's the first piece. The second piece is a bright line. For a considerable period of time in this country, I could have answered your question in a very straightforward manner. PMPRB sets a ceiling price based on an understanding of a golden rule, which is the price will always be no higher than our basket of countries. So I could answer the question by saying, Wendy, if you were speaking of a patented medicine, that price must always be lower than the basket of 7, and that was the answer. Canadians could be reassured by that. Now, it's an incomprehensible, challenging, twisting, turning conversation involving math that no one recognizes, that acronyms that quite frankly are all emerging at breakneck speeds to even subject matter experts such as myself who are struggling to follow, that makes it unmanageable to answer that question, because simplification of the rules has not been a goal so far. I would love to say someone is working on simplifying this, so a Canadian who looks at the price of a product can go, I understand that this is regulated, I understand the rules are this. This is a benefit for Canadians, this is a benefit for innovators, this is a benefit for government, that it be clear as to what that bright line is. Unfortunately, it is evasive at this point.
And I know that our next panel is going to talk a little bit about the implications of the uncertainty and complexity and how that affects the ability to bring products to market. Someone's also asking about, what do you see all of this as, how would that impact clinical trials in Canada?
Clinical trials is critically important to Canadians, not only from advancement of science and therapeutics, but also the benefits that it brings. PMPRB has it as part of their evaluation framework. It is at face value challenging to understand how a marketplace tries to attract clinical trials, but not have a pathway for commercialization, be holistic in its approach or competitive in its attempts to attract clinical trials. So there has to be consistency in terms of how the regulations are applied from a pricing regulation perspective, approval point of view, as well as the clinical trials, to be competitive, to attract investment from other countries to Canada. I see this as being incongruent in terms of the approach and intent.
Mm-hmm. I think another area that people have been concerned about that doesn't have as much visibility is the impact potentially on patient programs. Because of course, we often talk about our healthcare system as being a socialized healthcare system, but as you've talked about, depending on what province you live in, whether you're covered by private insurance, what the mechanisms are, and where you receive your healthcare in some cases, because the funding models while you're in a hospital are different than when you're in the community. But I'm not sure that the awareness of how many patient programs are actually have a mixed funding model depending on where you sit, and what's the potential impact on some of these funding programs, on some of these patient programs.
Quickly, my role at Pfizer is also leading pipeline development and looking to advance, accelerate new innovations from Pfizer's pipeline to the benefit of Canadians. We look at holistically the gates or the parameters I explained earlier. Health Canada, PMPRB, CADIF, and ultimately to reimbursement. But the very important question of how long it takes to get reimbursement in this country has been an outstanding issue for years. If we had had this workshop 5 years ago, I would have said the delay in access to innovation is our number one issue. Unfortunately, these challenges from PMPRB with the regulations and the guidelines, which are coming into force in July, have now surpassed the challenges of the time to listing. But my point is, in that delay period where innovation, the science and the clinical trials have provided clarity as to the benefit of the product, Health Canada works within parameters to deliver an approval within a set framework, but the pathway to reimbursement is often delayed significantly by process procedures that are sequential, to which industry certainly Pfizer will look to solutions which allows patients to benefit from programs for access to occur while the process is underway. This is in the context where commercialization and reimbursement are viable. If the marketplace is not viable or is challenged from a complexity or uncertainty point of view, I don't know how these programs make sense in the long term if it's not clear that the Canadians will ever have a benefit to these products, at least in the traditional timelines that we had discussed earlier.
And if you're bringing a new product to market, as we look at the products that are coming up, of course, many of them may be more expensive, many of them may be more personalized. HBES talked about, value-based procurement. How if you're bringing in, for example, a therapeutic that requires infusion and it's either brand new or it's replacing something that might have instead have been a traditional, you take it with a glass of water. How do you navigate PMPRB as you're bringing in not just a new therapeutic, but a new therapeutic that requires execution in a very different manner?
In the Canadian setting, it involves positive differential clinical evidence as well as positive differential economic evidence. And those two pieces have to come together in a way to support the value from a broad citizens perspective. So not just PMPRB. These value dossiers have to resonate with public payers, private payers, health technology assessment agencies, and they have to come to their own conclusions as to what is the value proposition and what is the appropriate reimbursement mechanism for those therapeutics. The challenge with the PMPRB is that they're trying to act as if they are the one and only determinant of the clinical and economic value all at once, in a way that's likely inconsistent with their mandate traditionally, but certainly speaks to why I was mentioning as opportunities real world evidence and outcomes-based agreements, which would be a mechanism to enhance where required clinical evidence or economic evidence or both, while facilitating access so that Canadians can benefit from these advanced therapeutics, while assessing the value proposition over time. This is why I described the lost opportunity of the last 5 years. Instead of working in this space, we've been talking a very technical jargon as the preferred method, as suggested by PMPRB.
And as we jump to, because ultimately the provinces are the ones that are executing, executing healthcare, so to speak. PMPRB has a role. How does this then translate to you're launching a product in a province? And I think there are examples of some outcomes-based agreements in the provinces. So how do you get from PMPRB, which is just very, although in a confusing manner, looking at just numbers, so to speak, broadly, I guess, but how does that then translate into the provinces?
Look, in the quick answer as to what this means for PMPRB, I honestly don't know, which is the big cloud of uncertainty around how you actually get through PMPRB so that we can we can actually work through the reimbursement mechanisms for patients to benefit as quickly as possible. So there's tremendous uncertainty, and this is difficult even for the most experienced of professionals in the PMPRB space. This uncertainty is beyond reach, and certainly if you think of patentees who were working with one or two products, unfamiliar with the Canadian landscape, they will find this unmanageable and unnavigable, if that's a word, in terms of how to actually get through this system and being compliant at the same time. The provinces have an important work to do within their own jurisdictions and private payers. Critically important as well in terms of the value and the benefits that it brings. But these solutions, either the clinical, economic, combination of both, in the setting where the patients are being treated and the value that represents to their families, would be different in the private market versus the public market. The private market may be concerned with more evidence to do with presenteeism, absenteeism, and productivity of the employee, versus a public payer who's concerned around hospitalization, cost offsets versus other more expensive or life debilitating conditions that shortens lifespan, unfortunately. So all of these processes happen at the same time. PMPRB is not facilitating that progressive mindset, if I can say, in the space of real world evidence generation and outcomes-based agreements. And both of those concepts are absent in the lexicon that PMPRB is proposing as well.
Yes, because I think, I know in our province, there's a lot of work around trying to bring innovation into many of our health authorities. And that can obviously be products, services, solutions, process innovation. And so while these are two very different elements of how innovation comes to market, they obviously impact it as people are looking at bringing innovation in. I think one of the challenges at the provincial level, of course, also ends up being that it's more bucket funded. So you have the drug plan budget and then you have the other budgets. And so it's hard if it doesn't start at the beginning to look at that broader real world evidence and outcomes analysis, which those of us who may be used to writing business cases for other things, this gets super complex, because in other areas, if you're introducing innovation, you look at what is going to be the outcome, what is the benefit, and what is the return on investment. And this complexity, of course, makes it really hard. I don't envy the payers in trying to navigate this either.
I'll just, and I probably should have mentioned this early, but obviously, the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board, as a judicial tribunal, operates within a legal framework, which is separate from obviously the provinces, and operates, as they describe themselves for a number of years, as a bit of an island, quote unquote, in this ecosystem. So they very much operate in a framework that is framed by their regulatory responsibilities. That's not to say that they can't reassure Canadians that prices are not excessive in a framework that is consistent with where we've been for the past 30 years, while allowing for, as you described, the provinces to innovate in their space by looking at value-based procurement methods and other approaches, right, that brings innovation into that space. It's hard to do this where you try to converge everything into one space from a regulatory, jurisdictional, administrative, or value proposition.
There's a question that I'm going to take a little bit of liberty over, and it's really around data and forecasting impact. And of course, on the assumption PMPRB goes forward, truly not forecasting, but analyzing impact. And there has been so many conflicting, inconsistent analyses out there. Does the PMPRB believe it's their mandate to review what potentially the impacts are, or do you see it continuing that various different groups are going to be bringing forward different analysis of what the impact of these changes are?
I think so. So first off, that's why I thought it was important to discuss the policy framework assessment that's being proposed. Is very, very important for people to weigh into and to reflect on from their own point of view, because for the foreseeable future, reporting and data sharing and analytics will go through that framework to deal with intended consequences and unintended consequences. And I think as stakeholders, it's equally important that we engage from our point of view, progress made and opportunities lost at the same time. And I think that has to happen in a parallel framework, because there's going to have to be policy conversations and forums that occur as checkpoints over time to calibrate why the divergence of opinion, is there a convergence of opinion, what needs to be course corrected. These are all important milestones. If this framework moves forward in July, these are all extremely important points for us to anchor on. And even, just anecdotally, I can share with you, in 2015, 2016, when the case was being made for the changes to move forward, it was communicated that Canada was second only to the US and slightly ahead of Germany at the time. Our assessment confirmed that, in fact, this was driven by two things: the presence of multi-source products in the basket of products being reported on as being the rank. So a bit of an apples and an oranges conversation going on in terms of what was being shared, as well as important fluctuations at the time to do with currencies that was not commented on. So the case originally was overstated, in my opinion, based on the analytics that various groups and peers within the industry had completed, along with the trade association. I thought is an important milestone in saying we never really agreed on the facts when we started this journey 5 years ago, and here we are really not agreeing on the facts in 2021. And this policy framework, I think, sets us up well to course correct over time if we see the unintended consequences really materializing in the short term. So I'll stop there.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. We appreciate you taking the time to share both how it works, but also your breadth of experience in this area. And it's been super informative. There is a final question, which I'm actually going to push to the next panel because it's more talking about what other countries are doing and what approaches. I think they're going to get into that. So thank you very much, Mark. I'm now going to introduce Tom Digby, who is the head of Digby Global, to turn on his camera and introduce the next session. Thanks, Mark.